My name is Kathy Ferguson. I'm 74 years old. I live in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I was born in a little town in Indiana called LaPel, Indiana. I grew up on a farm. My family jokes that I grew up in a Norman Rockwell painting. It was like the philosopher William Gass calls it the heart of America. Um, so I had a great childhood, and I had a herd of ponies and all the dogs, cats, chickens, rabbits, sheep, pigs, cattle that one could want, um, and great family. I um, went to high school in this little tiny town of LaPel, Indiana, where there were 82 people in my graduating class, and it was a good school for the time, and it's gotten even better. Interestingly, this little town now has people moving to it for their kids to go to the schools. So I think that's really to their credit. Um, I went to Purdue University for my BA. I had wanted to be a veterinary, and I was accepted into the pre-vet program, where incidentally I discovered, this was before Title IX, that girls had to have a higher grade point average than boys to be admitted, because they didn't want that many female vets. So that stunk. But anyway, I lost interest in that because basically I discovered political theory, which of course you don't know exists when you're a kid, in a not very sophisticated academic place. So I didn't know people did that sort of thing. They thought that, they asked those questions, and I just couldn't believe how interesting it was. And I really that's what I wanted to do. I kind of didn't know what political thinking was. I was a good student, which meant I studied hard and got good grades, but I didn't have any sense of an intellectual project or leading an intellectual life, because nobody did that I knew of, or at least they didn't talk about it in a way that let me understand it. So I got to Purdue, and I had some great teachers, and it was 1968, so it was a very good time to be in college. There was so much happening, and so partly it was just that it was the anti-war movement and the civil rights and feminism and the beginnings of environmentalism, all those things happening around me. So that certainly got my attention. I had one particular teacher, a fellow named Michael Weinstein, who passed away not too long ago. And he was that teacher for me, that one teacher that we all need, that just models for you, doesn't tell you what to do. He just shows you what he does. And you find a way to do some version of that. So I had a combination of the political circumstance and the pedagogical opportunities, I'd say. I kind of started off realizing how narrow the political horizon of my home life had been, just because of the absence of sort of anything out of step. Everybody was kind of in step. They were all kind. It was a wonderful community, very loving, but it didn't encourage critical thinking. And so once I found you could do that, then I think my first sort of political step was probably pretty common for young people who are raised similarly to me, which was I kind of became a liberal. I thought I was so opposed to the Vietnam War, and I thought of it as a mistake, that the government was making a mistake. And if we could convince them that they were wrong, if we could show them evidence that we're not winning that war, and communist menace isn't going to take over our lives if we don't squash the Vietnamese, then they would stop. And I think a real turning point for me was the invasion of Cambodia and also Kent State, because those were kids like me, in a university that's just the next state over. It could have been me. And so I that was shocking. But then I started to realize that the language of an evil policy being an error overlooked the structural investment that the state and the economy had in doing that war. That it wasn't just that they, oh my goodness, what was I thinking? They weren't going to do that. When they learned what I learned, they were going to brush it off and continue to do what they were doing because it wasn't a mistake. It was a consequence of a certain kind of capitalist colonial state system. So that was pretty major. Also, I discovered feminism. I read Simone de Beauvoir. Well, actually, I started with Shulamith Firestone, The Second Sex, which is a lot easier. And I couldn't believe it. Wow, people asked those questions? That was great. And so I went to de Beauvoir, and she was pretty challenging for an 18-year-old with no background, but my teachers helped me. And I just thought, what a great idea to develop a thoughtful lens and then use it to view the world. As opposed to thinking you're just viewing the world per se, that being unaware of the lenses that you bring to it, that doing the opposite of that, being aware and sort of deliberately finding resources to craft a lens that would be a useful and liberating way to understand life and history. That just was, so I wanted to do that. Well, I've always been comfortable saying that I'm a feminist. That's never been sort of a question, really, not since college. And you asked me about my educational background. I forgot to say I then went to grad school at University of Minnesota, and that was a good place for me because it was very tolerant and open-minded. And again, I had that one professor. His name was Mulford Sibley, and he was a Quaker and a pacifist, and somewhere between a socialist and an anarchist. And so again, I said, "Oh, you can do that? Okay, I want to do that now." And so I guess that's where I am. I'm somewhere always feminist in the sense that I always think that gender and sexuality are on the table as relevant to kind of anything, that you should always consider how they're working and to whose benefit. But then sort of realizing that there were all these people on the left that I didn't know about, that once I started to read them, no one of them seemed completely right, but I had learned by then, don't look for that. Don't look for the one right thing and then embrace it. Look for contributions to your thinking, and then kind of assemble them. And that's how you make your own theory. I was very taken in college and continuing in grad school and in life by learning about existentialism. And again, through de Beauvoir, but also Sartre and Camus and, the whole crowd. And through that, realizing that it's important to think of politics, change, power in terms of processes, that you always have to think about how did this come to be? That's what I learned from Foucault, is you always ask, how did this come to be? And you give it a history, that there's no such thing as there's no origin for anything. Something went before. And so you try to identify emergence, and then you see what you can do to kind of tilt that emergence in a less cruel, more liberating direction. So maybe I'm just constitutionally optimistic. That's possible. But I always felt like as long as there was a chance to move the way things were going in a better direction, I didn't have to fix them. or I could live with not fixing them if I could contribute to moving them a little bit. So I partly, I guess, having somewhat chastened expectations of what I was going to do. Um, but maybe it's also like not trying, like I think that part of what attracts me to anarchism is the idea that most people, not, you can't speak for all anarchists, of course, but one theme that I like a lot in the kind of anarchists that attract me are that the importance of a movement. It's not you as a lone individual, conquering and making your way and I'll win. And it's not that. And we tend to think that way in the United States because we have such an individualistic perspective. So we look at Martin Luther King, we don't look at the civil rights movement. And so I just realizing that it was important to be part of a group that might be an immediate group of people that I see a lot, or it might be a more diverse sort of social base for politics. But that's where I'd get something done, is if I worked with people. Well, that's a great question. Wish I knew the answer. Um, I like reminding or teaching my students that one of the things I've learned from Marx was he says that capitalism is we're either going to get socialism or we're going to get barbarism. And it looks to me, looking around at the Trump world, we got barbarism. And but maybe that other alternative, we can still work for that. That if you think in terms of a process, then you're always thinking, well, what will be engendered by this? What options can emerge out of these things? How are those things changing? And so I feel like, in a sense, this question has gotten a little easier because we live in a time of rising fascism. We're dealing with a fascist government. And I don't think that's hyperbole. My more conservative colleagues think I'm exaggerating. They'll think, well, Trump won't come after us. He'll just go after those people at Harvard, and that's okay. And of course, it's not okay. But it seems to me that fascism, in a sense, makes distinctions between critical perspectives less important than what they have in common. I guess I'm a big believer in coalitions. We're back to, you got to work with people, and I don't think you can just work with the people who see the world just like you do. Those might be your best friends, and that's fine. But politically, you got to be able to say it's enough that we're all going to agree on this thing, and I'm not going to focus on the things that are outside that area of agreement so much because we're doing work in this shared space. There's a famous article by a feminist named Bernice Johnson Reagan, and she says that coalitions are not your home. That, your home is the place where you're comfortable because it's already yours. And the coalition is the place where you gather the energy to work with people that often you'd really rather not, but we need to be together on this thing. So that's kind of how I feel about Trump right now, is that I think that we have to, by showing as many people as possible, by doing what anarchists have always done really well, which is communicate. Anarchists are great at that. You get 3 anarchists in a room and you'll have a journal, right? And then you'll have a mutual aid group, and then you'll have a prefigurative thing happening, and then you'll have a bike co-op. And I always find it so ironic that people think of anarchism as chaos and the lack of organization, whereas Alexander Berkman, he said, organization is everything. And he meant that we had to continuously organize ourselves, not that someone else would do it. And so I feel like bring the I want the biggest anti-fascist coalition I can find. And so people who are willing to say, oh yeah, the elites suck, they're terrible, we shouldn't have elites. If they then go on to say, and we shouldn't have immigrants, and everybody, the richest, everybody should try to be rich. I mean, that they have to. It's important what direction those ideas are going in, and that thing called right-wing populism. That's just another face of fascism to me. I mean, what's the populist part? You're willing to be critical of an elite as long as it's not yours? That's not very critical. So I feel like I also think that we on the left, we have an advantage because we have such a magnificent history to draw on. That's one of the things that the reason I do the work I do academically is that I'm so interested in anarchist movements and how they worked, how they did what they did. How did those people do that? Like the modern school movement just blows me away. These are humble people with few resources, not a lot of formal education most of the time. And they created these magnificent schools. And some of them lasted 50 years. I think that's so impressive. Or the history of journals and what the anarchists have done in terms of just insisting. Anarchists, it seems to me, at heart, are teachers. And at heart, I'm a teacher. That's what calls me. And so to just be communicating all the time. So, if you get people to read your journal, great. That's one way. If you get them to hear your speech, great. That's another way. Get them to take your class, great. That's another way. You can just sort of constantly offering the world an opportunity to learn this, to come to these ideas and figure them out for yourself. I guess I think that's something I can be enthusiastic about. Sort of no matter what else is happening, you can always teach. I just wanted to mention an anarchist group I was in when I taught at Siena College in Albany. I taught there before I moved to Hawaii. And they came to my mind as I was talking about journals because we were a little group of people that just came together. We met, some of us, at anarchist conventions. There's a kind of lefty college in the neighborhood, and Murray Bookchin taught there. And so there'd be conferences that students would probably organize. And I don't know how else we met, but we created this group and we made a journal. And I have come to appreciate that group so much because I was very young. Then I had just started my academic career. So I was like 25. And I didn't know yet this history. I didn't know that when you have three anarchists, you have a couple journals, that's what they did, was write and publish. And our journal was called Mutual Aid Alternatives. We only did a half a dozen issues. I have only kept a couple. But someone gave some copies to Paul Averick, the historian of anarchism who died some time back. Well, when he died, he donated his collection of anarchist literature to the Library of Congress, and bless their hearts, they kept it, and they did all the work that libraries have to do to make something accessible to the readers out of the donations they get, which are often just a pile of stuff. And so you can basically read Paul Averick's library. So that's what I was doing at the Library of Congress, and I found our journal. And it was just so cool to have that sense of continuity and of participating in a historical flow. And so that's a good thing. We should all do that. And so two of the people in our group that I wanted to mention, one is David Week, and the other is David Porter. And David Week was a sort of an old-time anarchist actually, he had been a conscientious objector in World War II. So he was an older guy, and he worked on this journal called Why, with question mark, why, that came out of New York City. And he and his partner, Dina, I think her last name was Augustino, something like that, were part of that, and they learned to print. I love that. They learned to print so that they could make the journal. And David taught at Rensselaer Polytechnic, RPI, in Troy, and he was just a gentle, determined anarchist. I learned a lot from him. And David Porter, he wrote, he was the guy who collected Emma Goldman's letters on Spain. And he also wrote a powerful book called Eyes to the South on French anarchists' views of Algeria. And so David was part of it too. So I had these senior people around that had never happened before, everybody was always my age. And so to meet people who had been sort of activists their whole lives, and they were still funny and smart and interesting and not filled with despair. So, okay, you can do that. So, okay, I'm going to do that. So it's just all these opportunities I feel like I've had to kind of see in action a good way of thinking or a good way of politically acting and taking it to heart.